he first suggested why vegetarians have smaller brains. I thought that would offend too many people and renamed it to why vegans have smaller brains.
But the moral is you need to be eating animal source foods to get that vital nutrient.
So the best food production systems for us, for the planet, and for animal life is pasture-reared meat. So that's cattle, sheep, goats.
It's also worth pointing out that a vegetarian or vegan diet actually involves more animal death than a carnivore diet. If you can improve your health with a simple change in your diet without any side effects, that's a much better route. We've been eating this way for 300,000 years. And our health plummeted when we switched from the diet that we evolved with to the diet that we've started eating since taking up farming 10,000 years ago.
Hey folks, it's Dr. ShawnBaker here. Hey, if you or someone you love is suffering from chronic disease and you're tired of just managing symptoms with potions, pills, and procedures, I want you to check out Revero.com. Our team of dedicated professionals is committed to tackling the root cause of your issue and finally getting you healthy. Hurry up, though. Our spaces are filling up very quickly. Welcome, everybody. We've got an interesting group today. There's a book that's out there that has a very provocative title, and so we'll get into that in just a second. But first, let me just start with Anita. Anita, give us a little 1-minute background of who you are.
I'm a retired medical doctor. I qualified from the University of Cambridge in the 1980s. I worked as a GP most of my life. More recently, I did a master's in nutrition. And since then, I've been working on this book, and I have a regenerative farm with livestock on it, managing that as well.
Very nice. Well, let me go to Alison next. Alison, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Alison Morgan. I'm a farming specialist, and particularly in terms of the impacts of farming on the environment, with a background in farm advice and farm research. I've got a degree in agriculture from the University of Reading and a postgrad in global development.
Okay, and then finally, Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dave Ellis. I graduated in Earth Sciences in geology in 1981. I then spent a career in oil and gas business as a geophysicist. I retired a few years ago, and since getting involved in this book, I've been learning a lot and finding it really interesting about nutrition and farming.
Okay, well, the title of the book is Why Vegans Have Smaller Brains and How I think cows can save the planet, or something along those lines. I know the first one caught my attention. So that's intentionally provocative, as you guys know. And so whoever wants to, why don't we start about the premise of the book, why it was written, and then we'll get into maybe some of the details.
I started writing the book on my own originally, and Ali and Dave joined me 3 years ago. I want to tell the world about the Sapiens diet, which I think is the best diet for people. And if farmed in a certain way, it's also the best diet for the planet. We didn't want to write just a diet book. We wanted to write a book that connects health, diet, farming, and the environment, which is why we've written it as a team.
Very good. Yeah, I certainly, I've been in this space of promoting diet, would include more meat in there, and certainly I've had my time sort of contending with the vegan pushback, and so this is obviously going to maybe enlighten some people, maybe upset some people. Why do you guys feel that a sapien diet, however you describe it, I assume it's probably a diet that's rich in meat and regeneratively grazed meat, and probably some other whole foods would be my guess. Why? Where's the evidence that supports that? Why do you come to that conclusion as a physician, as someone who practices as a physician? And then we can get into obviously the farming, and I don't know how the oil and gas background goes into this, but I suspect there's an interesting twist there. Why do we think that?
So the evidence is based on evolutionary evidence, our human biology, paleopathology, controlled studies, as opposed to food diaries, which most modern dietary guidelines are based on, and which isn't very sound, and also our own personal experience.
Yeah.
Vegans have smaller brains. Okay. I'm interested. Why do you say that? Why does the book say that?
Well, actually, it was a friend who came up with the title. He first suggested why vegetarians have smaller brains. I thought that would offend too many people and renamed it to why vegans have smaller brains. There is a lot of evidence on brain scans and diet to back this up. There's brain scans on babies, on middle-aged and elderly people, and studies from the University of Oxford, the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, and brain atrophy in babies from all four corners of the world.
So, I've seen studies suggestive that, B12 status might have something to do with it. There's probably other things. Do we know, if I were to say, I don't want to eat meat because, and you live in obviously you're in India where a large percentage, maybe I think something like 25% of the population is vegetarian, and there's probably a significant number of vegans in that group. What are you supposing is driving that finding, and how is it showing up? Is that something that we can significantly say?
Sorry, I'm actually just on holiday here. I don't live here. But in India, it has one of the highest B12 deficiency rates in the world. I think it's about 72% of that order. Yeah, it's high across the world, but it's particularly high in India, the B12 deficiency rate.
Yeah, and that has an impact on our brain development and I guess maintenance, I suppose. We see that certainly as people get older, they start to lose. If you do a CT scan of an old person, often we'll see atrophy, irrespective of maybe their diet, I suppose. Although most of us are probably B12 deficient, probably, I would guess.
Yeah. So B12. It's a vital vitamin for the brain to keep the brain healthy when you're young, when you're older, and in between, but it's only found in animal-based foods. So if you might be okay being vegetarian if you include dairy in that, because you can get some B12 from dairy. But it's the title is about vegans. We wanted to be provocative because there you're not going to be getting virtually no vitamin B12. But we know that this is something that the body needs. So that's the source of, if they suffer brain atrophy, it's true, as Anita said, in breastfed babies of vegan mothers, they're not getting the B12 that they need. And the scans show that their brain starts to suffer as a result. And you have to intervene as quickly as you can with B12 supplements or injections to be able to reverse that atrophy. But the moral is you need to be eating animal source foods to get that vital nutrient.
We also know that there are other things like DHA that you can't get from plant foods, and many other essential vitamins and fatty acids and so on that we can't get from a plant-only diet.
But interestingly, in the baby brain scans, the ones with severe brain atrophy, if you catch it in time and give them B12, you reverse it completely. And you can see on the brain scans that they've gone from severe brain atrophy to completely normal after a few months of treatment. And if you don't catch it in time, these babies sadly suffer permanent brain damage.
Let me ask you guys, because this is, animal sourced food, in my view. I'm clearly an advocate of this, but it's destroying the planet, right? Right. Well, maybe we should delve into that part a little bit.
No, it's not destroying. It's not livestock production, the kind of livestock farming that we're talking about that's destroying the planet. In fact, the evidence is the other way. The worst farming and food systems are characterized by an absence of livestock and grassland and livestock. So we're very clear that intensively reared livestock are not good for the environment or for the animals involved. But neither is arable farming. So the best food production systems for us, for the planet, and for animal life is pasture-reared meat. So that's cattle, sheep, goats. And these are all ruminants that produce methane, which is a thing that we're all told is causing climate change, but we would disagree with that.
Do you guys, let me just, when you say agriculture systems without animals, what is that? Is that the monocrop agro? Is that what we're seeing in almost, what is it, the place in Spain where they've got like massive greenhouses everywhere?
No, it's not. It's across the industrialized world. So I worked in the east of England, which is our main arable farming area for many years. And I've also worked in the west of England, which is predominantly grass and livestock. So in the last 100 years, we have decoupled arable farming, crop farming, from livestock farming. So traditionally in our history, 100 years ago or more, we always grew rotations. So you would grow wheat, barley, and then you'd have a year or 2 or 3 years of grass grazed by cattle or sheep. And the reason for that, which farmers have long known, is that crop production depletes the soil and damages the soil, and you need grass and livestock to put the carbon, the organic matter back into the soil, and also to break the cycle of weeds and pests and diseases. So we've long known that crop farming depletes and harms. It also eradicates the habitat for wildlife, whereas grassland farming restores, and grazing livestock can live well with the wild animals if you do it low impact, extensively, and regeneratively or organically.
You know, let me just, Dave, you have been, I guess you said, in the oil gas industry for a number of years. That's obviously been quite vilified as well. I mean, this is something that, we hear about climate change, we hear about greenhouse gases, we hear about how we have to, divest ourselves from fossil fuels. We need to have wind turbines and solar panels and everything. What is your contribution to this, given your background?
It's not so much my geophysics background, it's just more of a general kind of scientific. Most of what I've been doing on the book has been helping to edit chapters, especially in the diet section, and come up with figures and graphs and so on. But in terms of where we are with climate change, we're careful not to get too deep into that. Clearly, we've seen over the last 100, 200 years big increases in things like carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. And one of the things that, of course, is cited as being a cause of that is our burning of fossil fuels. Now, wherever you sit on that, there's another cause that we identify that has also put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And there are studies that suggest that up to 1/3 of the increase we've seen in the last century or two, 1/3 of the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has come from arable farming. And the reason for that is that arable farming involves ground disturbance. You disturb the soil. You turn over soil that was buried. The carbon content in the soil is then exposed to the air and can be oxidized into carbon dioxide. So the focus of our book about diet and about its relationship with farming is about the damage that arable farming is doing to the soil and to the atmosphere. We could go a long way if we wanted to go down the route of reducing carbon dioxide emissions from man's activities, from people's activities on the planet. One of the things we should be addressing is the damage done by arable farming. And it's a red herring, because the media and most opinion only focuses on livestock and methane. And that's a complete red herring. It's arable farming that should be scrutinized.
Let me, sapien diet. What is it? Can you guys describe that?
Yeah, the Sapiens diet, it's an animal-based food diet. In its strictest form, it's just animal fat, meat, and small amounts of offal. We recommend the strictest version of the diet to people who have any kind of severe disease. There is an optional small amount of fruit and vegetables that's allowed. The guidelines say at least 5 portions a day. We would say 1 or 2 at the most. That's the essence of the diet.
Yeah.
And is this for sick people or is it for anybody?
I would recommend it to absolutely everybody, but especially for people who have any kind of disease, diabetes, overweight, autoimmune diseases. They're all either ameliorated or reversed with this diet. But even people who think they might be healthy might actually have insulin resistance and not know it. They might have visceral fat and not know it. And all these conditions would be reversed with the diet.
Are you seeing that in practice, in practical terms? I mean, it's like I said, I know what I see, and I obviously espouse a very similar, I guess, belief system. What do you guys see?
So actually, the diet is based on what's called the paleo-keto diet. There's a group in Hungary who've done a lot of research into it in the last 15 years, and the evidence comes from their clinic, and that's what they've seen. They've published papers on their findings, and that's what it shows, that autoimmune diseases especially improve, diabetes gets reversed, and people who are overweight get down to a normal weight.
So for me, I started following this a couple of years ago, and until then, I know in the US you have the food pyramid, and the version that we have in the United Kingdom is called the Eat Well plate, and that of course is the food guidelines that tell you should be eating lots of grains, lots of fruit and vegetables, and limiting your intake of meat. I used to follow that, and when I was introduced to this diet, I was slightly horrified, but I tried it. So, for example, in the morning, I would typically always eat cereal, whole grain cereals, with lots of berries and bananas and stuff mixed in. And Anita suggested, well, no, switch to a fried breakfast, something like, bacon, sausages, eggs, and so on, a little bit of offal. I tried it. It was delicious. And I didn't think I was overweight, but I did lose weight. And I lost inches around the waist. I've gone down from something like a 33, 34 inch waist down to about 30 inch. So I'm assuming that's kind of probably a lot of belly fat, visceral fat that I've lost. So I immediately saw an improvement in my own health and felt a lot better. So yeah, I've had no problem following it, and I've seen improvements for myself.
Likewise, I've had major improvements. I've been following the diet for about 4 years. I was ketogenic for a little while before that, but still including vegetables and olive oil and stuff. But then I cut out all the plant foods and saw a dramatic improvement in a number of conditions, like acid reflux just disappeared. I lost a lot of weight. I had a skin condition called rosacea, which I'd had for 20 years, and it disappeared within 2 weeks. Barrett's esophagus I'd been diagnosed with, and that's just the symptoms stopped, and that was reversed 2 years later when I had another checkup. So that's just a meat-based ketogenic diet with no plant foods.
Yeah, I mean, you guys mentioned, obviously paleomedicina, or I can't remember what they call themselves now. I've known like Jafia and Chatato for years.
Clinic,
and in fact, I was in Hungary a few months ago, back in Budapest, and met with Sophia.
Oh, right.
I've known her over the years. And so, yeah, I'm very familiar with her work, and I've cited it over the years, obviously expanded upon some of that with what we're doing. As far as, I mean, obviously, your own personal experience is sort of probably driving some of this, and that's what a lot of us do. We actually find out what actually works for us personally, and then we get interested in that. In the UK, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's been sort of maybe a climate change based pressure to sort of scale back animal agriculture. I've seen some of the farmers talking about how like they're being, maybe being put out of business due to inheritance taxes and so on and so forth. Is that still the prevailing thought, or is there quite a bit of pushback against that?
Yeah, there is a lot of pressure on farmers in the UK and in Ireland, where the Irish government is trying to cut the number of cows in particular because of the methane production. And in the UK, various parts, farmers are being asked to set land aside and plant trees on them. And in particular in Wales, which is on the western side of the UK, which is largely grassland and a lot of permanent grassland with cattle and sheep. And farmers are being asked to set aside 10% of their land and plant trees on it. And you really wonder why, because temperate grassland actually stores more carbon in the soil than temperate woodland and forest does. So digging up grassland to plant trees is a complete nonsense, really. Whereas if we wanted to plant more trees, we should really be planting them in the east of England, where all the arable land is, because that's where most of the emissions are really coming from, and that's where most of the environmental harms are coming from.
Yeah, I've been aware of that for a number of years. People don't realize grassland actually sequesters more carbon than do trees. I think that's something that people should be aware of. I'm glad you guys are
they should be aware of that. That's right, Shawn. But we really have got it in for the media. The media reporting of these issues, both on diet and on farming, have got it almost completely, have got it completely back to front. So the narrative that you always see, if there's a story in the newspaper about farming, it's usually about cows produce methane, and methane is a greenhouse gas. Therefore, cows are helping to cause climate change. And that's the only part of the story they tell. You'll be probably familiar with the whole biogenic carbon cycle. Mm-hmm. So yes, cows are producing methane, but they got the carbon for that methane from the grass they ate. The grass got it out of the atmosphere from photosynthesis. And the methane that they do belch breaks down relatively quickly back into carbon dioxide, rejoins a cycle. You've got a cycle.
So it's just the flux. It's just a constant flux.
Different parts going on, but the media, they ignore the photosynthesis. They ignore the fact that methane breaks down quickly because it's a flux gas. They ignore what's going on in the soil. The only part of this cycle they report is cows produce methane. So that seems to be what everyone remembers, including those who create policy in government, who then say, well, let's reduce our livestock and plant trees instead. Yeah. What gets a free pass is arable farming, which everyone seems to think in the press is totally benign. But as Ali says, if there was one place where we ought to have a policy of rewilding, it's in arable land in the east of the country, not livestock land in the west of the country.
Yeah, because the way that we farm arable cropping these days, as opposed to 100 years ago or so on, without grass and without livestock in there, it's completely dependent on agrochemicals. So we've got huge acreages all over the UK and the United States and everywhere else in the industrialized world, where it's just one crop after another, no grass, and so there's no animal manure going in and restoring the carbon. So it's just completely dependent on artificial fertilizers and pesticides. And those have hugely negative impacts. First of all, in terms of the carbon emissions produced by the manufacture of those agrochemicals, and then in terms of the impacts of those chemicals on wildlife and the environment. One of the things that people fail to recognize is the harm that pesticides are doing. Many people know about the harms that pesticides are doing, or they know in theory, and people will tell you we don't see as many bugs on our car windscreens these days as we used to, but they don't connect that with crop production and plant-based agriculture. In the UK, we have very good pesticide records. Farmers are required to make very good records of what pesticides they use. 99% of the pesticides that we use are used on arable land, not on pasture land. And the devastation that we're seeing of insect life, of earthworms in the soil, and everything else is horrific. For one example, an average crop of wheat in the UK, we apply 20 different toxins to it every season, and that's going on to the soil every season and just devastating the environment and the ecosystems.
So, Ali, one of Ali's
pointing out. Sorry, it's also worth pointing out that a vegetarian or vegan diet actually involves more animal death than a carnivore diet.
Yeah.
Yes.
So one of Ali's chapters is called "Wheat is Murder." So the example, the figures we put in there are shocking. It's the same situation in America, but in the UK, an area of land, if you wanted to grow wheat, it takes about 1 square meter of wheat to get enough grain to make 1 loaf of bread. In that square meter, there are thousands of insects. I've seen figures on the internet from between 2,500 up to 9,000 insects. That's 1 every 1 or 2 centimeters. So you're spraying this field of wheat with insecticides with the intention of killing insects. So that means you're killing around several thousand insects per loaf of bread. There's about 20 slices of bread in a loaf, so you're killing hundreds of insects per slice of bread. And then there's the impact that has on the rest of the food chain, on bird life, on the field animals that would be living there, or would be living there if they weren't evicted to keep them out of the way of the crop. So the death and destruction involved in arable farming is enormous, and it goes completely under the radar as far as the reporting of it goes.
So one of the things in this country is we've got 16 species or more of protected birds that are protected by the UK government, but farmers are licensed to shoot all of those birds to protect their crops, and it's almost entirely for crop protection. 3 million wood pigeons a year, that just one species. In Australia, in New South Wales, 40,000 ducks every year are killed just to protect the rice crop there. So it's global, this shooting and poisoning and trapping of animals to protect crops. So the loss is far higher than the life lost to feed somebody on a carnivore diet. So, for instance, one cow will maintain one person for about 2 years, roughly, in terms of the amount of meat and fat. It's a complete diet. It has all the fat, all the offal, all the protein that you need, and nothing that you don't need. So that's the kind of equivalent. So one life for one person for 2 years, whereas bread and vegetables and things costs millions of lives of animals and small creatures.
Hey folks, it's Dr. ShawnBaker here. Hey, if you or someone you love is suffering from chronic disease and you're tired of just managing symptoms with potions, pills, and procedures, I want you to check out Revero.com. Our team of dedicated professionals is committed to tackling the root cause of your issue and finally getting you healthy. Hurry up, though. Our spaces are filling up very quickly. I'll eat more than one cow a year just for perspective, but I get it. The average person probably doesn't eat quite as much. But, one of the things that is often, cited, you mentioned the biogenic methane cycle where it's a 10-year, 12-year cycle where, the methane goes in the atmosphere, is broken down and then returns to Earth. And we do that. But, in the UK, as you guys probably know, they've come up with an additive. They're, feed additive. I think Bovaer is a trade name. I can't remember what stores it might be in. How is that being received? And, because the thought is, okay, we're not going to get rid of cows, but we're going to make them less gassy by giving them this. Is it useful to do that, or do you think it's solving a problem that doesn't really exist?
Yeah, we think it's solving a problem that doesn't exist because we don't agree that methane from ruminants contributes to climate change. In fact, we are saying that it's the reverse. We're capturing more carbon in the soil from grass-based cattle. So it's a problem that doesn't exist. Perhaps it's, you could argue it's more of a problem in intensive dairy farming. But either way, you're interfering with a natural process. And it's the old thinking, again, of human intervention, another bright idea that we really don't know the problems that it's going to cause. What impacts it will have on animal welfare long term, what impacts it might have on the environment. We've had lots of these ideas before, only to realise that they cause devastation in some way later on. And so from our point of view, we're in favour of regenerative farming, or at least organic farming. We don't want to be adding additives or even grains to animals that are grazing animals.
Yeah, and you have obviously some great grazing area there. I was in the UK up with my friend David Unwin, which maybe you guys know or aware of David. Dave, he's a bit of a conservationist and likes the animals, and showed me all the lambs and stuff running around up in the lake. I guess it's called the Lake District, I think, and very beautiful scenery. And I think the animals are part of that. What, I guess, obviously there's been a lot of political change rapid throughout the world, and the UK being no different. Where do you guys see things going? Do you think they're going more in the direction that you feel they ought to, or are they going the wrong way primarily?
I fear it's going the wrong way.
Yeah.
And I just think this narrative about cows are bad and we don't want to know anything about arable farming, that's not the problem. It is just so pervasive. It's really difficult. There is one. I mean, I'm not sure if you've seen the programs that are being done by Jeremy Clarkson in the UK. He's a well-known TV.
He's got a farm show. I haven't seen one episode.
He's turned his hand to farming.
Yeah,
and that has actually done more to raise. And he's trying to do it. Obviously, he's doing it the way that it appears on the way it's portrayed is kind of very entertaining. But there is a serious message there. He's trying to do it regeneratively and friendly. And he does talk about the role that animals have in restoring soils. And that has brought that message to a wider audience. But I think he's still seen as something of a maverick, certainly in kind of, the mainstream press. They haven't really picked up on this as a serious issue, that there is something wrong with arable farming, and it's not livestock farming they should be picking on.
I think our book will help inform policy in the future. Books like ours, there are many which have a similar message, like The Great Plant-Based Con and Sacred Cow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And there are a couple of years ago, the Sustainable Food Trust in Britain published a very good report that was going in the right direction and commenting on the need to reduce the amount of grains and oil seeds and sugar that we grow in Britain, but it's the same everywhere. So we would say that there's this myth that animals are using too much land and that land is being wasted. We would be better off growing crops on that land and eating it directly as human food. That's simply untrue, because a lot of the land that is used for grazing livestock is marginal land. That, 2/3 of the world's agricultural land is marginal land that cannot be used to grow crops for one reason or another. And animals are making very good use of that and contributing a lot of nutrition and very high quality nutrition to the world. So it's getting over these myths, and we would argue that we would be better off health-wise, and we would be better off in terms of our environment and the climate if we actually converted arable land to grassland, both by, if we want to grow some crops and vegetables and things, then at least grow them in rotation with grassland and grazing animals, so that you're going to a more organic or regenerative style of production, or even just convert it to permanent pasture and eat more meat from permanent pasture regeneratively.
Yeah, the question that always comes up is, can you produce enough food in that style of system? Because we have this industrial system, which is very obviously chemical intensive, but these chemicals provide these tremendous yields that we've now turned into, the food products basically. And we have a population of whatever it is, 8 billion. I don't know what the projections are. It was like, we're going to go to 10. And now people are saying there's a fertility crisis and maybe we're not going to reach that. So how do we, I don't know that a regenerative system could completely replace the industrial part. Is it, we just need a bigger share? What do you guys obviously if they made you guys in charge of food, which, probably won't happen, but if they did, how would you guys do this? How would you transition?
That report that Alison mentioned, Sustainable Food Trust, it did recognize, it says we need to shift animal farming to pasture fed. We need to, more carefully, be careful about what we grow in terms of crops and the amount of crops. But it did acknowledge that, that would probably lead to reduction in yields. But it did make two other recommendations. One is that we need to waste less, and that's all the way from, the farm to your fridge. There's an awful lot of food waste, and also to eat less. So I'm not sure that it still balanced the books in terms of, the title of this report was Feeding Britain from the Ground Up. It was trying to say, can we be self-sufficient and sustainable in the way we produce the food? And it is going to be a challenge, but there are things that we could do, as I say, waste less, eat less. And those are things that you can easily achieve on a meat base. My food waste from my fridge has plummeted. I don't waste meat.
The other thing to note is that the current system is geared towards providing calories, not nutrients. And crop farming produces many calories, but not necessarily nutritious food. So there's that in the whole equation. Plus the 1/3 of food gets wasted anyway. That's a huge amount of food.
We've got a chapter called Embargo the Avocado. So in Britain, we import 2/3 of our fruit and vegetable consumption. And a huge amount of this is wasted either in the home or in transit from wherever it was grown. And most of the countries that we are importing from are climate vulnerable, water vulnerable, poor countries. They should be producing food for themselves, and we should be producing food for ourselves locally as far as possible. And there are figures that indicate that about 1.4 billion hectares, I think it is, of the world's land, agricultural land, is taken up with food that is just wasted. We'd only have to halve that in order to feed the world's population in 2050, completely feed it. At the moment, we're not feeding the existing population. We could halve that and feed everyone if we just cut down on the amount of food imports from particularly of fruit and vegetables, grains, carbohydrates, because that's where most of the waste is coming from. That's where most of the emissions are coming from, and most of the water misuse is coming from this trade of food.
Yeah, we're always told that if you have a hamburger, you're consuming the equivalent of 16 swimming pools of water for every some ridiculous stat. What are your thoughts on the water issue with raising beef, lamb, so on and so forth?
Yeah, so we cover this in Embargo, the avocado. People have this misconception that cattle use too much water and that they're the biggest user of water. Dairy cattle certainly do use a lot of water because you've got a lot of water to clean down parlours. The animal's producing an awful lot of milk. So they do require a lot of water. But what people don't understand is it's what kind of water. Beef cattle, sheep, reared at pasture don't use so much water, and all the water that they're using, or the majority of the water that they're using, is what we call green. It's a green water footprint. So that's rainfall directly onto the land. It would fall on the land anyway. The animal is eating it through the grass that it's eating. It urinates some of that water straight back into the local water cycle, watering the soil that the grass is growing on, and so that isn't as harmful. Whereas if you take nuts or avocados, they're using huge amounts of water, and it's a lot of it is what we call the blue water footprint. So that is water that's drawn from aquifers or for ground. So it's water that has a much bigger cost. For instance, in Chile, some parts of Chile, people are being restricted, the local population being restricted to the use of 50 litres of water per person per year. That's about a third of the water that we use in the UK. And yet every avocado plant on the local plantations is getting more water than that from irrigation. So actually, these fruits and vegetables and nuts in particular have the worst water footprints. I don't disagree that livestock, like intensive dairy production in the wrong environment, such as in the Middle East, can be very, very, and so it's not appropriate for that area. And in intensive pork or poultry production, where you've got all the animals in a house and you're giving them water that's been drawn from groundwater and reservoirs and so on, that's quite high use of water and has higher impact. And also you're using a lot of what we call the grey water footprint, which means the amount of water that you're having to use to dilute polluted water from insecticides from crops causing pollution of water causes and artificial fertilizers used on crops getting into the water causes. So that water has to be diluted and treated before it can go back into the human water system.
Anita, you as a physician, as a GP, you probably didn't always promote a sapien-based, animal-based diet.
No.
How has this sort of changed your perspective on medicine?
So that's one of the reasons why I actually left medicine, because I would have found it very difficult to continue giving low-fat dietary advice to patients now that I know it's wrong. And other physicians have been, people have gone after them for giving dietary advice that goes against the guidelines to patients. So yes, no, I wouldn't like to be working in general practice at the moment.
Do you think that can be salvaged though? Obviously, it's like you've got this. I mean, obviously, if you like what I've seen, I see people every day putting disease in remission with just by making a simple dietary switch. I mean, it's like 30, 40 years of chronic disease is gone in a month or two by just changing their diet, which is very powerful. And I mean, that's obviously something you want to share. You wrote a book, you're talking about it on social media. So how do we, I mean, because I think knowing this, we're compelled to do something about it. I think it's hard not to say anything at some point, right?
So many have made a start in the UK. I don't know if you know Dr. David Unwin, who's a GP.
Oh yeah, I spent a lot of time with David. Yeah,
he's a low carb GP. He's starting to get the guidelines changed for diabetic patients. In his own practice, many of his patients have reversed their diabetes. It saves a huge amount for the NHS in not having to prescribe drugs and less ill health. Yeah, it's the way to go. And I have a good friend who's reversed her diabetes with a low carb diet. It's hopefully it'll catch on. Then there's organizations like the PHC UK, and yeah, the message is getting out there. But I think it's very slow for the medical profession to make such a big change.
Isn't it better just to give everybody GLP-1 receptor agonist shots, Ozempics, and just let them eat what they want? Isn't it?
I don't think so. I think, well, if you can improve your health with a simple change in your diet without any side effects, that's a much better route. Who knows what the long-term effects are of all these new medications?
Well, and they're prescribed by the boatload, at least here in the U.S. But but the same criticism will be we don't know the long-term results of a sapien or an animal-based or a carnivore diet, and so therefore we shouldn't recommend it.
Yes, we do.
I'm sorry. Dave, go ahead. Yeah, go. One of you guys say, not both of you at the same time. One of you guys respond.
Eating this way for 300,000 years. And our health plummeted when we switched from the diet that we evolved with to the diet that we've started eating since taking up farming 10,000 years ago.
So in your book, sorry, Dave, because I don't know if you want to call it revisionist history, will say, no, it's not really, humans were not eating a carnivorous diet or mostly carnivorous diet. There was a lot of fiber. We're eating 150 grams of fiber a day because we were just rummaging through and eating all these leaves and roots and things like that. What are you guys referencing as a source of information to say that we've been eating this way for 300,000 years, as long as we've been Homo sapiens?
So,
you go ahead.
No, so I mean, the evidence of studies, since we split from the chimpanzees about 6 million years ago, the trajectory has been one way. The brain evolved because we ate meat. It's interesting, actually, that the more meat we eat, it's not that we became stronger. We get this idea that eating meat is about pumping iron and putting on protein and putting on muscle. What differentiated us over those 6 million years is that it grew our brains. It's brains, not brawn. So you go to Australia, 4 million years ago, Homo habilis, about 2 million years ago, Homo erectus, and then us. The trajectory has been the more meat that we ate over that period, the bigger our brains grew. Our brains have trebled in size in those years. At the back of the book, Homo sapiens have been around for 200 to 300,000 years. And we squeezed that 300,000 years into a 24-hour clock. So all the evidence is that for over 23 hours of that day, we were carnivores, we were meat eaters. We were scavenging, hunting for meat and the associated fat and the associated offal. It's only been the last 50 minutes that we started, doing agriculture, the agricultural revolution. And it's only been in the last minute or even few seconds that we've now had our food guidelines. And look what's happened in those last 10,000 years. The graphs show that our brain has started shrinking, and it's gone down from a peak of around 1350 cubic centimeters down to 1260. Why has that happened? Is that due to decreasing amounts of animal food in our diet and increasing the amount of grains and plants in our diet. And in the last 10 seconds, since we've had the food guidelines, the food pyramid in the US, in the UK, the Eat Well plate, last 10 seconds, we've seen the trebling in levels of obesity, trebling in the levels of type 2 diabetes and other Western type diseases. So we would say there's the evidence. The greatest study, the most, we mentioned earlier on about how these unreliable epidemiological observational studies that have so-called informed the food guidelines, they are all at odds with the lessons from our evolution. So we would say that's the best study of all.
But in terms of how we've actually changed and how those changes show that we're used to a meat-based diet, our gut anatomy has changed. The colon has become smaller. The small intestine has lengthened. The small intestine is where animal foods are absorbed. Our shoulder anatomy has changed compared to all other primates so that we're better at throwing, and that's a useful skill for hunting animals. Our sweating system is better than any other land-based animal. We can outrun other animals. There are many, many changes to show that we've evolved to eat a meat-based diet. These are some of
Another
the
one
other thing is that we've got good evidence from people like the Inuit that, they lived for before the last century or so, they were living on an all-animal diet, and it's only since they've been forced or encouraged to change to a Western-style diet that they've developed obesity, diabetes, and all these Western diseases. But they lived on nothing but animal foods before. And there are many other cultures where you see the same pattern. I worked in Mongolia. The diet that they followed was basically similar to ours, mainly meat, a lot of animal fat, plus a lot of dairy. And now they're changing more and more to a Western diet, and they're seeing more health problems and obesity and so on.
Yeah, I think rural Mongolia, particularly in times past, would be a good example of, carnivore diet is it's like Tuesday for them or whatever. Fat is, okay, so let's talk about fat for a second here, because fat, particularly animal fat, because it has saturated fat in there, has been particularly vilified. But in my experience, fat becomes critical when you reduce your carbohydrate consumption. When you reduce it to next to nothing, you've got to have a decent amount of fat. Where is that fat going to come from? Because this is my one criticism to some of the pasturing, is that sometimes it's hard to get enough fat on those animals. It's sometimes those animals become very lean, and it's challenging to get an adequate enough fat to meet your energy needs. Because, if we go back into evolutionary times, we were hunting things like elephants. I mean, that was clear. We ate these proboscideans, elephants, mastodons, mammoths. There were a lot more mega herbivores for us to choose from. So how do we contend with fat? Is it bad for us, Anita? Saturated fat, and then where do we get it from in this system, this sapien system?
Absolutely, it isn't bad for us. We would say vegetable oils, the slow poison. The amount of saturated fat in beef fat, for example, is roughly 48%. That's the type of fat that we've evolved with, and that's what suits us best now. It is possible to get enough fat. For example, on my farm, when a cow goes to slaughter, we get huge bags of fat back every time a cow goes to slaughter, and we can make that into beef dripping ourselves and use it for cooking.
Depends a lot on what breed.
Yes, it does. Modern breeds are leaner, and they've been bred to be lean because that's what people have wanted. But native breeds in the UK have high levels of fat, but Ali will know about that.
Yeah, and our British native breeds tend to be fatter and tend to be smaller. And over the last 40 years or so in Britain, we've completely changed the landscape of beef farming and brought in European breeds of cattle like the Limousin and the Charolais, which are bigger, much leaner, but they require more grain feeding to finish, especially if you're trying to finish them. They don't finish so well off grass. It's true that if you don't feed any grains, it's going to take you an extra year to finish an animal. And that is a serious issue that we have to discuss. So with a beef animal in Britain on grass, it will be finishing at between 2 and 3 years old, depending on whether it's a male or a female. But the thing is that with beef production generally in most of the world, it's even conventional systems where you are feeding some grains, it's still much lower input in terms of agrochemicals and grains than other forms of farming. So far lower input agrochemical wise than arable farming, and far lower grain input than pigs or poultry, and lower grain input than dairy farming generally. There obviously sometimes you have what we call barley beef or factory beef, which is just intensive and fed on nothing but grains and soya. That's pretty negative in terms of the welfare of the animal and in terms of the environment because of the grain production. So we're still saying that even with conventional beef where you're feeding some grains, it's still better than other forms of food production.
Actually, before I had a farm, my local butcher used to give me fat for free, fat that he'd trimmed off other cuts of meat. And if you just cut the fat into small pieces and fry it till it's crisp, it's really tasty and you can just eat that.
Yeah. And every animal that goes to slaughter in this country, there's a huge amount trimmed off. About 10% of the carcass weight gets trimmed off as fat. And that's because of the diet heart hypothesis, this idea that eating saturated fat causes heart disease, which is completely the wrong way round. That has driven us towards these lean beef breeds and to trimming off fat at the slaughterhouse when we should be eating that fat and making use of it. And of course, it's really tasty.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah. So anyway, unfortunately, we're just out of time, guys. I really appreciate the name of the book again is what?
Why vegans have smaller brains
and how cows reverse
climate change.
Yeah. Why vegans have smaller brains and how cows can reverse climate change. And that's available anywhere online, Amazon, that stuff. Okay. Well, wish you guys very well with that. Continue the good work. And, I think it's worth fighting. So thanks for doing that. And I appreciate y'all being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shawn.
Thank you, Shawn.